Yeah, so today we're going to talk about game development and how you could maybe work in this space. So hi, I'm Alina, as was mentioned. At the moment, I am currently a software developer at Ruckus Games. Previously, I was a game designer at the Coalition. Um, so yeah, that's kind of like my current job. We'll do more of my background later, but I guess initially I want to get us started on like what game development even is. Um, Basically, like games are complicated, but also like art and also like involve a lot of engineering, and there are a lot of like moving pieces that come into making any given successful game. I love this quote by Frank Lance here. Games are like operas made out of bridges because you're trying to make this artful and like fascinating and beautiful experience for a player, but it's also like very technical at the same time. Uh, so a lot of game development is kind of very role based. So you'll have a lot of different specialists working in a lot of different areas. These are like kind of a common set of them. So game design is generally like planning the games, like what it's actually going to like the systems within it, or what they're going to look like. 2D game artists tend to draw lots of like concept art, or depending on the game, that might be doing sprite work or like portraits, all kinds of things. 3D game art tends to be like 3D models, and sometimes animation gets involved in there too. UI UX is like lots of UI, so like all of the buttons and like how you interact with the user interface is very like UI UX centric. Production usually involves like scheduling and kind of managing the team into making the project actually happen and figuring out like budgets and things. Sound design does anything audio for the game. Usually they'll also work with composers. Programmers program, surprise, that's the one I've probably done the most of. And then yeah, writers work on like creating the narrative inside of the game. So these are kind of like very high level paths that you might have available to do, and they specialize way beyond this. Personally, I've done like lots of parts of a lot of these in like my personal projects, but I've also been like paid to do game design and software engineering at a professional level as well. So like it's something you can definitely explore a lot of different things within as you're making games. You don't necessarily need to feel like nailed down to one role per se, but it can make it easier to kind of have a thing you're focusing on as you're going throughout your career. So, yeah, the basic thing you're trying to do when making a game is create the ideal player experience. So you want something that someone can take, uh, pick up, have a good time with, and then, move on with their life. And maybe they like it gives them something to think about. Maybe it's like a beautiful world they can explore or a story that they can like really get invested in. Or maybe it's just something that like they get in and have a good time with their friends at. The games can be a lot of things to a lot of different people, and exploring what that player experience looks like is the root of a lot of game development. So I guess we'll talk about my career. Some of the early attempts I had were in college. Um, I was always interested in game development from like pretty young, and I had some early attempts at like making games on my own. Um, just like writing narrative, like branching narrative stories and that kind of thing. But I didn't necessarily get to like a higher level of it until I started learning programming in college, or programming in high school, and then more of it in college. So my programming in high school kind of enabled me to like start actually building things instead of just like speculating. So programming is probably one of the more valuable skills you can kind of start to work on in this space. This is a picture of one of the little games I made in college. It's a little team project I did. You control a little crab. It's kind of primitive, but at the same time, like you have to start with these smaller projects, and then you can kind of build off of those from there as your skills grow. Um, yeah. So in college, I also started self-teaching myself Unity. I went to study computer science in undergrad, which was super helpful in terms of just getting me more of a background in specifically programming. But at the same time, a lot of college programs don't necessarily teach you everything you need to know. Mine did not happen to cover any game engines or game-specific technology at all. So I ended up having to sort of teach myself a lot of those skills in addition to my classwork. I think that might be changing over time. Um, we definitely are starting to see a lot more game-specific programs come out these days. I know my university actually started one like right after I left. Um, so those are sort of a developing thing in the field you can kind of keep an eye out for. Yeah. Uh, so after that, because I started teaching myself Unity, I ended up getting involved in a lot of research opportunities at my university. So I ended up working with professors on different projects and ended up doing VR research. At a point, I got an internship with an educational games company, Smarty Pal, for a bit, and that was also like a really good way for me to like deepen my experience in like company environment, which was really helpful at the time. Um, yeah, so it was basically like paid Unity experience, which was super nice. Any way you could kind of like keep food on the table while learning the skills that you need to learn to do this is like super valuable and can be really helpful, like not just for that time in your life, but in terms of just building the skills you need to go forward as well. Um, so one of the other things I did a lot of in school was hackathons and like game jams, essentially. This is one of my teams from Code for Good and another one of my teams from Reality Hack. They are basically, I don't know how familiar you guys are with the idea of a hackathon, but it's essentially like a couple days, sometimes up to a week of working on a single project with a team of other developers and or students. And they're super useful just for like experimenting with something you've kind of had in the back of your head for a while, networking. You can make a lot of friends at these kinds of events. They're super useful and valuable and kind of help you like play with ideas in a more like concentrated environment that you don't might not necessarily like have the focus to by yourself. So I highly recommend doing like hackathons or game jams or anything along those lines if you can swing it. Um, yeah, so some of the VR research I did was like health-based because some of my professors were working with it at the time. It was using like all of this technology that I basically taught myself in school. A lot of like game engines are used in that kind of space. So that was super helpful at the time as well. And then at a point, I got involved in hardware. Project North Star is like this open source AR headset that I ended up working on for a little while. It's basically like this 3D printed AR headset. So it was a pretty interesting experience and definitely like was a useful way for me to like work on things I thought were interesting and then like was able to take that knowledge and then bring it into grad school with me. So after some of this like research by myself, I ended up getting into my university's PhD program and like worked on more research in this sort of area and like still like some of it was AI based. So I ended up working on like a character generator for a little while, which was pretty cool. Um, and yeah, I did things. I also started a game development meetup group for a while, the Delaware Games Collective. It was basically a way for me to build a community of game developers in the state I was in, and we would meet up and work on our games together, maybe like every couple months. It was great. We had a lot of like prototypes and interesting conversations together and could kind of give each other feedback on the things we were working on. So finding like any sort of community like that can be really helpful for just like working with other people on things. Over COVID, I ended up dabbling in board game design, which I think is a super helpful way to learn about game design and kind of do more of that sort of work without having to like deal with also programming. So like tabletop games are great. I highly recommend. Like if you exclusively look at video games, you're missing out because there's a lot of interesting things in the tabletop space too that you can kind of play with and still like work on learning those building something for someone to play skills without the overhead of software development. Another early game I worked on was just like a little parody game. It just made it was more an experiment for me to see like if I could make something from a game that I liked and the systems that they had available there, like if I could replicate them in my own work. So making parody games or like existing games can be a really good way to practice your existing like skills and just see if you can do it and sort of push yourself towards making something more interesting. Um, and then I can't necessarily talk about the current things I'm working on because non-disclosure agreements are super real. But at the moment, my work at the coalition and Ruckus has been very interesting so far. So yeah, um, I guess beyond that, I guess I have a handful of recommendations, I suppose. One of the really nice things about game dev in particular is a lot of the information you need to work with is already online. You just kind of have to get out there and start doing it. YouTube is simultaneously your best friend and worst enemy. There are a ton of tutorials for game engines, for doing art, for doing programming. Like you just have to, start looking for them. In terms of just like deadlines and getting involved in like a community, there's online things like itch.io. They have a rolling events calendar of game jams that basically constantly come and go that you can hop into and like work on a project and then put it in front of any amount of people. And that can be really valuable for just getting your work seen. So those can be super useful. And then like real life hackathons can also be really helpful too. I highly recommend them. Sometimes universities will host them. And then sometimes companies will host them as well. So definitely keep an eye out for those kinds of opportunities if you can swing it. Um, yeah, there are a lot of technologies you can kind of start to look for and work with. Game engines like Unity, Godot, Unreal, and Twine are all like free, and you can like look up tutorials for things like that and try to make stuff with them today. That's probably one of my better, most like that's one of the things I recommend you do it at the very least. Companies are generally looking for people that have any amount of skill to work with, and having shipped games on your portfolio is super useful, even if they're like small, because it shows you can finish something or anything at all. That is about all I had. I mostly wanted to leave a lot of time for questions and just talking and seeing what you guys wanted to know. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you, Alina.
Yeah.
As a reminder, pardon me, as a reminder, if you have a question, type it in the Q&A chat box, or if you're watching on Facebook, type it in the comments section. Looks like we've got a question from Jared. How would you describe the work project environment? Fast pace, long, short project schedules, lots of dependencies or interconnectedness?
It's definitely a longer environment. Games projects tend to take like they're on the scale of years. You'll be at a company for like maybe 2 or 3 years minimum shipping a project, and the time scales like seem to get bigger rather than smaller. For context, I've been at my current company for maybe a year. It'll be a year and a half in July, and we're at least 2 years out from shipping the game we're working on. And at my previous company, we were very early on in the process, and I think they're probably going to be another like 4, 5 years minimum. So it's a very long like project cycle, and you have to be kind of prepared for the fact it's more of a marathon than a sprint. Um, yeah.
Right. Okay, that's fascinating. We've got another question. Which coding languages would you most strongly recommend learning, or if there are multiple, in what order would you progress?
So one of the things you kind of find out as you start learning programming is there is a lot of overlap in your knowledge between coding languages. Once you've learned one and a lot of the fundamentals, it becomes really easy to like transition to other ones because you kind of know a lot of the basics. There's this wonderful website, Learn X in Y, and it gives you basically like a syntactical overview of a lot of different languages. It's almost like a Rosetta Stone for programming in that you can like look at it and be like, oh, this is what like a for loop looks like in C++ as opposed to Python. Hooray. Um, so one of the better things I think you could do is work with one that is that works with a game engine that already exists. So in my case, I ended up learning C Sharp because it's what Unity ended up using. But like throughout college, I also learned Java and worked with C and C++ and Python. So like expect to work in multiple languages and expect an amount of that knowledge to transfer throughout different like projects and tech pipelines.
Awesome. We've got a question from Kelly. Pardon me, I'm a little bit sickly over here. Mm. Kelly asks, where would I start? I'm 12 and learning HTML.
Oh, okay. So if you're younger, there's a lovely website slash programming language called Scratch, and that's aimed at those like younger groups. I think their official target is like 6-year-olds to maybe 15 or so. But it's a lovely little place to kind of get started with visual programming. So basically, instead of typing code, you'll have these different blocks that you'll start to put together in order to make your game project happen. So that if you're like younger, that's a super useful place to start. I super wish I had something like that when I was your age, because man.
That is a great resource. I didn't even know that was a thing.
Yeah,
Um,
Scratch is
thanks-
lovely.
yeah, thanks for laying that out. So we've got another question asking, what type of an education is useful for this kind of job?
So it's one of those things where it depends. Those roles I had, I'll just bring it up again, closer to the beginning, are like they're all kind of their own specializations. So, depending on which specialization you're most interested, different types of schooling are going to be more or less useful for you. Since I'm doing a lot of programming and software engineering, a computer science degree made sense for me and has been super useful in terms of just like knowing more about how to do the craft of programming. But if you're more interested in doing 2D or 3D art, you might be better served at art school. Or like if you're more interested in doing sound design, you might be better served doing like music or something. So it's kind of going to depend on the sub discipline that you're interested in. But you can always experiment with them in like smaller capacities where possible. So.
Awesome. We've got another question. This one's asking on behalf of his friend. It's been over 5 years since he's played or touched anything related to video games. If he wanted to restart the process again, what would you recommend to get back on that process?
What, and just like learning video games and
Yeah,
playing new ones?
yeah, it seems like his friend wanted to be a video game designer and then dropped it for a while. How would you rekindle that or restart that process of learning again?
Mm. I think figuring out why you like it so much or what attracts you to it is one of the more important things you could do in that sort of headspace. Like figuring out what things you like again about it could be very helpful. So like I feel really energized by games that have like a lot of narrative depth, and I like really love seeing those kinds of things in the field and then like playing and experiencing them. I also get a lot of joy out of playing things with like my friends and family. So like anything cooperative tends to be very fun because then I can just involve the people that I love in this like hobby. Um, yeah, so like if you feel like you've lost your spark, I guess finding it again is very important, and taking time to like rediscover it is that feels like a thing that might be helpful. So,
Yeah, I think that's really solid. If you drop something for so long, maybe there's a reason, and maybe you just have to do some self-discovery again.
mhm.
Um, Looks like we got a question from DJ asking, what piece of advice would you give to someone who is an experienced software engineer that is interested in getting into game development?
Oh, so this actually happened to one of my coworkers. I had a coworker who was working at Twitch as just a software engineer, and he wanted to transition to game development full time. So he ended up building a portfolio. He learned Unreal Engine kind of on the side, like while he was at his day job. So again, that portfolio piece makes a huge difference in terms of like seeing you in terms of showing other people that you have skills that are relevant and useful to this craft.
Okay, that is great. Alina, do you mind if I stop sharing your screen?
Sure.
Awesome. Oh,
Uh,
actually, oh, thank you.
yeah, you're good.
I thought I could do it over here. Okay,
Okay.
so it looks like Chuck says he joined a little bit late and is wondering what you're working on right now. But of course, I believe you said that that's NDA covered.
Yeah, I can't talk about it too much, but I can point you at my company's website. They have, I think we have a little bit of a blurb and some concept art. It's ruckusgames.com is the current company. So, yeah.
Awesome. Ah, that must be hard. I would be wanting to talk about what I'm working on. Um, but that,
Yeah, I'm not allowed to yet.
it
Maybe
builds
later.
suspense. It's good suspense. We've got Logan asking, during your time learning Unity, would you recommend newcomers start with the creative side or the coding side?
Again, I think it comes down to what you want to do. If you are more interested in doing programming, then start with programming. If you're more interested in doing like the more artsy design parts, you might not even necessarily like want to start with a game engine then. Like I found doing tabletop development much more helpful in terms of just figuring out like game design and like system design than just playing with an engine. Like playing with an engine is super useful if you're trying to like program with one. And even if you want to like do game design, like you will need to work with a game engine and learn it. So it depends. It's always kind of an it depends.
All right. We've got a few more questions. Jason is wondering if there are some do's and don'ts for young developers, like a middle schooler, if they'd like to someday design and develop for a large brand. Any suggestions? So do's and don'ts for a younger person?
So I think the large brand part is a little bit of a trap. One of the things that a lot of people will like fall into is, oh, I worked at like such and such a big company. Like, oh, I'm working on Fortnite. It must be so good. And that's not necessarily always the case. You usually want to look for people and your teammates who are really talented and who can teach you how to grow. Those are going to be way more valuable than just like the stamp of a company in terms of like helping you get the most out of your career. So I would like instead of looking at a single company, look for craft, look for ways to build the things that you are most interested in and that you think will be the most valuable to not only you but other people.
That's good advice. And back to the basics. So, what type of classes would you recommend to take in high school to take those steps towards this direction?
Yeah, so in my case, I took programming classes as early as I could, which was like my last year of high school, I think is when my first programming class was. So that was super helpful for me. But again, if you're trying to do like 3D art or 2D art, you might be better served by taking an art class. So it again, it depends on the discipline, but yeah.
Sure. So we've got another question asking, do you have any perspective about the characteristics of gaming platforms, web, mobile, console, PC? Do they all have a time and place? Do any require higher levels of investment or team sizes to be successful?
They are all different markets and they all have different constraints, which is kind of something to keep in mind when working with any like particular platform or technology. Like you're fundamentally going to find different games on PC or like consoles compared to mobile because of how the market is set up in a lot of ways. The mobile market's like very like ad driven and like kind of quick games. You have like very small sessions compared to PC and console games that have like longer sessions. In some of my work with like VR and AR, we could do more interesting things because you were like more embodied in the space because of your like headset and like controllers just kind of be putting you more inside of the world than you would be otherwise. So the constraints of a given platform are always something to kind of keep in mind. Um, and that you can like work with them or against them. But there's also like a lot of room for experimentation too. So you shouldn't necessarily feel like limited by them either.
Sure. We've got another question asking, how do you get into UX or UI for games? What's that pathway? What's the pathway for that?
For some people, it might look like doing almost graphic design in that you might design like the screens for the game or like design the buttons or the HUD layouts. You might also design things like the flow between different like states or try and figure out like how the game should react in certain situations. So I think one of the things you can do is like front end design for web. So there's tools like Figma that are used for prototyping, that kind of thing that you can start to mess with. Um, I'm not aware of any like explicitly UI UX courses off the top of my head, but there might be some on places like Canva or not Canva. Um, there's like a half a dozen
Yeah, there's a lot.
Coursera. I'm thinking of
Oh,
Coursera as the one, but there's like a lot of like online courses on UI UX design in general, and a lot of those principles will still be applicable to games. Um, yeah.
awesome. Yeah, I would say there's so many different websites that if you're looking to learn a skill or whatever
Yeah.
sometime, it's all there for you.
There's a
Um,
lot of coursework on a lot of different topics. You just have to start poking around for it.
right. Um, and Kaizen asks, how would you recommend for your games to be seen by others?
So like marketing? That is almost an entirely adjacent but like separate discipline too. Like figuring out how to best market your game is its own skill set. There's all kinds of people that do social media marketing and like marketing in general. I haven't done a ton of this, like any of it, so I don't know too many details. At the like hobbyist level, you can do things like again put your game in game jams or like do things at hackathons or just try and like get involved in your local games community because then you can at least show it to like real people in your real life. That can be pretty useful. Um, yeah.
Awesome. We've got a question from March asking, she graduated with a BS in computer science ages ago. She says 1999. Is there a certificate online or somewhere she can touch up her skills? Obviously, it's been a while, and yeah, so is there any place, speaking of all those online courses we were talking about?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know about like certificate per se. I guess one of the better things you could do if you're like a little bit out of the game like that is learn a newer game engine. As of like right now, that looks like a lot of Unreal and Unity. So building projects in those engines are probably one of the more valuable things you could do for yourself. Um, yeah, like building even the smallest games portfolio can be very useful at like any stage in terms of just breaking in.
And I saw your website where you had a lot of your projects all packaged there. Would you recommend aspiring game designers to have their own website?
Yeah, making a portfolio website can be super useful. Mine is okay. I need to work on it to be honest. But having some like just a URL you can point to and be like, okay, here's like screenshots and videos and GIFs and descriptions of the work that I have done, and just being able to like show that to someone in a job interview can be super helpful. Uh, just as a quick way to be like, yeah, I this is my work, the work I've done, and it can communicate much more than just a resume by itself.
Sure. Speaking of job interviews, what are your tips on that process and what does that process look like? How do you prove your skills in that field?
Well, I mean, again, portfolio is super useful. Once you've gotten someone to call you back, sometimes they'll have you do like a design test or like a coding test. Programmers in particular will sometimes have like coding interviews. So there's a lot of like literature and work around that kind of thing, just like how to do coding interviews. That you should that might be useful to like look into. Cracking the coding interview is like a really often recommended resource for that kind of thing. Um, there's also design tests. The main positions I've like applied and worked within are game design and like software engineering. Applying for game design jobs, there's occasionally design tests where they'll have you like design a level or like talk about like, oh, how would you work within this like design scenario? So those are a little harder to prepare for, I think, because there's like not as much out there about like A, what they even are, or B, how to like perform well in them. So that one's a little trickier so far from what I can tell. But yeah, like yeah.
Right, good to know. Um, we've got another question from Kochai saying, what is your experience with AI development and what is your development process like?
Yeah, so in grad school, I was interested in sort of like the general generative AI development that was happening. A lot of the stuff you see now with like DALL-E and ChatGPT is based on like a handful of work from in that space that has kind of blown up recently. It's really funny actually. I was working on it maybe like 2 or 3 years before it exploded to this extent. Um, so one of the projects I was working on was a text-based character creator. So basically, you would like write a description of a character, and then we built a learning model that would take that text description and then try to create a like a character within a video game based on that description. It was very like prototyped. I'm not sure if the paper ever actually got published because I like left grad school beforehand. But it was a very interesting project and like AI development is very interesting as well to me, and I think there's a lot of cool things in that space that you could learn as well. One of the resources I found really helpful was Fast AI. It's basically this guy, Jeremy Howard's course for you to teach yourself AI development. Um, so particularly around like language models, but you can also do things like image categorization and stuff as well. So yeah.
That is interesting how you were working on all that before it became such a hot topic.
Oh yeah, it's nuts. Not like super longer, but yeah.
And Chuck asked, what is a game writer used for in game development?
So uh tech they kind of get broken down into separate roles, but narrative designer tends to be one of the like sub roles. And then yeah, just like someone who just writes. So you might work on things like mission text, item descriptions, the overall like plot of the game. I haven't done this very much in a professional capacity, but I have written like barks and stuff for smaller games that I've worked on and like dialogue and things. So it basically like anywhere text might appear in a game is something that a game's writer might touch. Uh, so yeah, I think there's like some guy online who has like a whole game getting into games narrative like website, and it's lovely, and I don't remember what it's called. Sorry.
Now, if you remember, go ahead at any time, say it. But
Okay.
no worries. We've got some more questions, and Kelly's asking, is Scratch the best coding language, programming language?
So there's not really a best programming language. Uh, the best programming language is the one that does whatever the problem you're trying to solve is best. So for like learning really early game development, Scratch is super useful because it gets you kind of into making things really quickly. For web development, you have things like HTML and JavaScript that are really good at that. Uh, but then games will often use things like C++ because it's faster and more performant, which can be really useful. So the choice of the technology you're using depends on what the end thing you're trying to make is and will majorly impact your decisions getting to that point. So it depends.
Varies, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've got some more questions rolling in. Rachel asked, do you have a recommended software for music that is free or cheap that allows for different voices? She's having trouble finding something to change her voice for 8-bit sound, for instance.
Mm. I haven't done a ton of audio work. I've only done like a handful of sound effects, and I was just using Audacity, which is like it's free and open source. There are almost definitely better things out there that I just haven't used. I'm not the best person to answer that question, unfortunately. Um, but I think VL Studio is like one. FL Studio, rather, is like a really popular one. Um, and there's middleware that helps you kind of take sounds you've already made and put them into the game, but I have not ex had too much experience with that particular subsection yet. So,
Right. Yeah, that's like a bit of a different trajectory.
I
Um,
mean, it's all related. It's just like,
sure.
yeah.
Sure. So when you're working on a game, are you working mostly alone, solo, on teams? How does that work?
So usually it's pretty team-based. In my position as a game designer, it was a lot more collaborative than it was as a software engineer, or tends to be as a software engineer. But yeah, I mean, as a designer, you're constantly like in meetings and trying to like hash out design problems, and then you might like go somewhere else and then write down some documentation about the problem and like how you're trying to solve it, and then you'll like bring that back to the team. Software engineering, you might just kind of get tasked with, oh, build this thing, and then go build the thing. So it does vary, but in general, it's pretty collaborative.
All right. I would assume you have to have really good communication skills in that case.
Yeah, it's very important for those particular like skill sets. And even engineering, like being able to talk to people is always important, turns out, because there are people everywhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, looks like we've got a question from, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, Dallin. How do you get involved with research projects at your university?
I didn't necessarily plan for it. It just kind of happened. I taught myself Unity and was like kind of loud, I guess, about like, oh, I want to do game design. And then I think one of my professors mentioned he had like a summer games project, and then it just kind of escalated from there. So yeah, being like open about what you're interested in can help you find those opportunities in school at least. So,
Awesome. Yeah, and I think just being louder about what you're interested in, you'll naturally attract people who want to collaborate with you.
yeah, there is definitely a lot of that. Like you attract what you put out there is super like definitely keep that in mind.
Absolutely. So we've got another question from DJ. What were some of the unexpected challenges of video game development that you encountered in your career?
So I guess so far, programming has its own bucket of challenges, and you'll kind of constantly be working on di solving different problems inside the game. So that one is like kind of an ongoing basis, and almost dealing with the stress from that has turned into its own like other different problem. Like you have to maintain your sanity and whatnot while still like making things progress. Um I think one of the harder things too is it can feel like you're not really making a lot of progress on a like the day-to-day level. So figuring out ways to visualize that progress that you are making, because sometimes like it can be harder to visualize progress even if it is happening. And like grounding your work in like smaller like wins can be super helpful, I think. So,
Yeah, that
yeah.
makes sense. You describing it being kind of like a marathon earlier,
Yeah.
you would have to throw in some smaller modules in there so you could still feel
Yeah.
like you're moving.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So what about internships? Do you recommend internships? Do game companies have internships available?
Yeah, so internships can be helpful. I had like most of my work ended up being research projects, but I did have an internship in college that was super helpful. If only just to like get me outside of that academic environment and like on a working team. Um, Game internships, like they happen, but they are kind of rare in my experience. A lot of games teams are looking for someone that can like do the work right off the bat, for better or worse. So, like if you can get one, great. Like more power to you. Please run with it. But I think depending on that to be your only source of experience can be a little bit rough, and you might be better off taking time to build your own like portfolio projects instead. Especially if it's like unpaid. Like, oh, okay, well, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it sounds like they're rare, but
If
go
you can
for
get
it. It's there.
one, go nuts.
Yeah, sure. So we've got another question asking, how different is it working on your own projects versus working for a company on a project? Is there more freedom with your own stuff, you feel?
Yeah, to an extent. In some ways it's more freeing, but in other ways it's like it's limited by you. When you're working on a project and it's just you, the only limitation is your skills. And sometimes that can be a very hard one to run into. Uh, when you're working on a team, then you have like that more interpersonal like collaboration. And like, sorry, you have a lot of other people you're working with, but then you're also like trying to build one specific thing together. You can't just like design the whole game by yourself and run away. You have to like work with all these people to make it actually happen. So it in some ways it can be more constraining working at a company compared to working by yourself, but at the same time, it's very like useful and helps you kind of like professionalize in the space. Um, yeah.
Right. So another question from Kaizen, any resources for 2D game animation?
One of the things I didn't mention, in terms of resources, there is a YouTube channel, that's game developer talks. It's like GDC is the Game Developers Conference, and they have a ton of like lectures on all kinds of very in-depth game dev topics. I super wish I found it earlier. I believe they have a couple talks about 2D animation, from the Skull Girls devs at least. There's probably more that I just haven't seen because there's a lot on there. Um, but yeah, like the 2D animation is like also its own skill set. So it can be applied within games for sure. But there's a lot to learn in just animation that you can probably find in like other spaces as well.
Sure. Okay, we've got another question asking, are there any game developer boot camps worth it, or do I definitely need a college degree?
I think again it depends on the discipline you're trying to go into. For programming, I found college useful. And then again, there are more game-specific programs coming up. It is a little hard to say how useful or valuable they're going to be, or if it's like worth the money, basically, because they're just so new. That might kind of be a like, we'll see. But there are occasionally like neat stories of folks that have done those programs running off and making like amazing games. Like I think the devs behind Outer Wilds uh made like they started in school and then ended up like taking their school projects and turning it into a company, and then that became a very successful game. So it's hard to say, but like school can be useful.
And along those lines, you said you had you said you had a master's degree and you were working on a PhD. Is grad school important for the field?
Uh, Honestly, I feel like it might have been a bad idea for me, but I also only did it because it was free. So, fun fact, when you get a PhD, you'll get a stipend to do it. So that's what made it worth it for me at the time. If I had not gotten a stipend to do a PhD and whatnot, I don't think it would have made very much sense. And I don't think any of my coworkers have master's degrees uh in this space. Actually, no, I think one of them does. But like generally it's probably not worth grad school. You can do it for sure, but it might not necessarily make sense.
That's great. I'm sure a lot of people feel encouraged that they don't have as many
Yeah,
bars.
you don't have to go to school for like 10 years to do this. You could just like start making things by yourself now and then go from there.
Awesome. And how do you get your ideas when you're making personal projects?
Uh, so a lot of them have been kind of inspired by other work. So like there's like a couple parody games that I've like worked on that are sort of just experimenting with the same ideas other people have done. Um, And then one of the other projects I was working on came out of a game jam. Like I was at a tabletop game jam with some folks and we worked on this idea for like a couple hours. And then after the game jam, I like took everything we worked with and then just kept working on it afterwards. Um, and yeah, so that has been helpful. I write a lot of things down too, like taking notes and just writing down your ideas and getting them out of your brain and onto like paper or somewhere you can actually work with them can be super useful. Because then it just gets it out of your head. So yeah.
Definitely, that's a great tip. Um, and another question being, what does your day-to-day life look like? What's a typical workday look like for you?
So as a software engineer, it looks like checking in with my team on different things that we need to work with and work on. for the game, and then I'll kind of like go off and do that by myself for a couple hours, just programming. And then we'll often have play tests where we get the team back together and then just play the game and like see how it feels and see what's broken and needs to change. So that tends to be like the software engineering kind of workflow. The game design one is similar from my time at the Coalition. It basically it was a little bit more collaborative in that I would like get together with my other designers and then we would like kind of take some time brainstorming different mechanics and what the game systems might look like. Um, and then like we'd maybe separate and then like work on writing up game design docs for those features we'd like talked about. And then like kind of come back and talk about it again. So it was definitely more meeting centric when I was doing design work than software engineering, but yeah.
And before we started recording, you mentioned it was exclusively remote. Is that for both of those? Was it exclusively remote?
Yeah, so when I was in grad school, the pandemic happened, for better or worse. And then after I finished up grad school with my master's, I ended up finding a remote job. And then after that job, I found another different remote job. So the two jobs that I've had after grad school have both been remote. I think it'll probably continue that way. Like the remote is a very popular and cost-saving measure for a lot of companies, and some places are being like a bit more stubborn about it. But I think at this point it's pretty much inevitable whether people like it or not.
Yeah, it sounds like it's I don't know if this is true or not. It sounds like the majority of game development jobs are moving in that direction. And
Yeah.
a lot of people describe having difficulty working from home. What are your tips for structuring your day productively working from home?
I do think I struggle with it on occasion. It is a little hard sometimes, and like you have to like actively be really proactive about seeking social time with not only your coworkers but also just with like other people. If you never leave your house for like 48 hours, and then you're like, huh, I feel bad today. Strange. How did that happen? That's try to avoid that if you can. I do find having like wind up and wind down rituals kind of helpful. So just like when I start working, I try to like light a candle, and then like when I'm done working, I blow it out. Some people find changing clothes before and after working helpful as well. Um, if you can have a separate space in your house that's just for working, that's ideal. Like just any sort of like this space is just work and like I don't game here, I don't like play here. It's just for focusing. That's super useful. Um, yeah, go for walks, go for lots of walks if you can help it. Before and after. That's like another kind of wind up, shut down ritual thing. Just going for a walk like before and after can be useful. Um, yeah. So it has pros and cons.
Yeah, for sure. I think having the intentionality about
Yeah, really like deciding like I'm like at this time I am done or like at this time I am starting can be helpful. So
yeah, I think the brain needs signals or cues or something like that.
yeah, one of the things I also have is a lot of smart lights and I have them on like a schedule. So like when I'm scheduled to like start working, I'll have them like turn on like a nice yellow. And then when I have them like when I'm like wrapping up for the day, I'll have them scheduled to turn into like this purple. So the whole like mood of my apartment fully shifts based on the lighting, which I find really helpful for just like, okay, yes, it's done. It is nap time now. Hooray.
That's pretty cool. I like that. I like colored lights, period.
Color
Um,
lights are very fun.
that's great. So we've got a couple more questions. What do you get enjoyment from playing your own games? Someone asked.
Some of them to a point. I feel like sometimes it's hard to sort of turn the like analytical part of my brain off when like playing my own games or like watching other people play my games. Uh, It's almost like looking at like a painting and like all you can see are the mistakes and like the things that could be better. And that turning that part of your brain off can be kind of hard at times.
I completely understand. Yeah, I'm a painter and it's sometimes it gets really challenging. I don't even like to look at some of the paintings.
Oh yeah, no, I totally feel that. Like
But sometimes it works out, so I guess it depends.
mhm.
Um, and Parker asked, "Do you get games for free?"
Uh, so at my last job at the Coalition, it's a like smaller company under Microsoft, so I got a year of Game Pass. Uh, but that is about it. The company I'm at now is much smaller and does not have any like previously released games to get for free. Oh well, I'm not that worried about it though.
So we've got a couple more questions here. Francisco asks, "What is the most fun part of being a video game designer?"
Uh, I really like kind of the creative aspects of it, I think. So like figuring out how to like make certain like feelings in the player is really interesting, or like just designing systems I think can be really cool. Um, just kind of like the creative parts of it I think are what brings me a lot of joy. And like experimenting with different ideas and systems can be very fun for me. So yeah.
Right, very nice. And we're coming up to the end of the hour, so I'll make this our final question. Um, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but Wakas asks, "What's your favorite game of the year?"
Game of the year. Ooh.
Or you can
See,
make it of all time.
that's always that question always feels like a trap. Like, oh, what's your favorite game? Man, that depends on the month. Like, I play a lot of games and I love a lot of them. It's hard to pick just one, but the one that I have been playing the most recently is called Slay the Princess. Basically, it's like this little narrative game where there is a princess and you are tasked with slaying her. It is kind of a horror game, but the way they handle their branching narrative paths is like super interesting to me, and I kind of love it. So the way they've handled like just the narrative in that game is gorgeous.
Very nice. I've never heard of that. I'll have to check that out.
It's so good. I don't show it to the 6-year-old, but
Okay, well, thank you so much, Alina, for taking the time to answer everybody's questions today. And
yeah.
yeah, thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning in today. For more information about Linda Hall Library, follow us on all of our social media accounts and visit lindahall.org, where I encourage you to sign up for our e-newsletter. And for the parents and teachers tuning in today, I hope that you consider supporting the library through the Linda Hall Library Foundation. Your contributions make all of this possible and freely available. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Oh, also one more thing. I'm on
Okay.
LinkedIn. It just FYI, and Twitter, but I also hate Twitter, so LinkedIn preferably. My name is Alina Christenbury. It should be pretty easy. I think it's just like AJ Christenbury is the like URL. But yeah, hit me up there if you have any other questions. Happy to talk.
All right. Thanks for sharing that. And I'm so glad you mentioned that because otherwise I wouldn't have found you for this awesome program. So check it out, guys. Enjoy the rest of your day.